From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our Books and Beyond program this afternoon. I'm Guy Molinar from the Center for the Book, and for those of you who don't know about us, we're the Reading Promotion Office of the Library of Congress, and in addition to these programs, we set up the roster of authors for the National Book Festival, which this year will be on the Mall September 26th. And if you go to our website at www.loc.gov, you'll find more information about the authors program probably in about a month. We should have that all settled. And I'm pleased to say that the President and Mrs. Obama have agreed this year to be the honorary chairs of the book festival. I also want to let you know that we're filming this event for later webcasting, so if you ask a question at the end of the event, you will become a part of the webcast. And I also ask that you please turn off all your mobile devices. I also want to thank our colleagues in the Motion Picture Broadcasting and Recorded Sound Division for co-sponsoring our event today. Most of you probably know Michael Sragow as a film critic for the Baltimore Sun. He is also a regular contributor to such prestigious publications as The New Yorker, Salon, The Atlantic Monthly, and The New York Times. Michael's biography of Victor Fleming, which he will discuss today, has been praised by the Washington Post as smart, sympathetic biography that Fleming deserves. Michael will be signing his book following his presentation. You can buy the books out there and he'll sign them here at the table. Michael is also going to talk a little bit about the work he did here at the Library of Congress. If you haven't had a chance to read Michael's book, I urge you to. It's really an excellent biography of someone who's not had a biography about him before. The first chapter of his book biography he calls The Real Clark Gable, and Michael Sragow is here to tell us why. Thank you.
Assuming that you don't know who Victor Fleming is, I'm going to give you the easiest possible introduction quickly right now. Of course, those are two of the most celebrated movies of all time. They're also two of the most controversial credits. Victor Fleming directed almost all of Wizard of Oz, and he directed 60% of Gone with the Wind, and he did it in the same year. Yet people have been taking those credits away from him ever since the movies opened. They've been handing it to the producers of those films, Mervyn LeRoy for Oz and David O. Selznick for Gone with the Wind. So who was Victor Fleming? And why isn't he as well known as Frank Capra or Steven Spielberg or even Leroy and Selznick? I'm going to spend the next half hour or so discussing that and explaining how the Library of Congress and institutions like it helped find the answers. For one thing, Victor Fleming was, as Selznick himself said, one of the most attractive men of Hollywood. When Katharine Hepburn visited MGM and saw three men approaching her, Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy flanking a tall, imposing fellow, she asked, "Who's the one in the middle?" It was Fleming. Fleming was also, as Selznick said, a master of cinematics. He was part of every major transformation in movie history from 1912 to 1949, from one-reelers to two-reelers to features, from silence to sound, from black and white to color. But he died young, and he died a decade and a half before directors became national cultural celebrities. He was also part of American history, the westward expansion, World War I, and the Roaring Twenties. But there was no paper trail for a biographer to follow after his widow's death in 1966, when the bulk of what remained of anything that constituted his papers were tossed out. However, it was possible to construct a paper trail using document collections and considerable tenacity. It's not too much of a stretch to call him a homegrown genius. He was born in 1889 in a tent in La Cañada outside Pasadena, California. He was the only member of Gone with the Wind to have grandfathers who fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. His maternal grandfather fought under Sherman at the Battle of Atlanta. His parents, pioneers from Missouri, entered irrigation work before making the step up to managing orange ranches. Victor's father died in an orange grove when the boy was only 4. His appreciation of Oz was rooted deep in his background. His own Auntie Em and Uncle Henry, Aunt Mamie and Uncle Ed Hartman, raised him during crucial moments of his childhood. Then his mother married a carpenter, Sid Deacon, who was getting out of the ranching business and into dowsing for water and oil. This fellow set Fleming to work drilling water wells. It fueled Victor's curiosity about new technology and machines. Victor became an adolescent gearhead and dropped out of school in his early teens. But he was intellectually curious. He really did read the encyclopedia and the dictionary from A to Z. And he became a first-rate mechanic, first on bicycles, then on cars. He did anything you could think of a young speed freak doing in those days, from working as a salesman and demonstrator to driving one of the first taxi cabs in Los Angeles. He wanted to become a race car champ. When he failed to finish in his first race, everything fell apart for him, including his first marriage. What happened next became a treasured story of film history. He became a chauffeur in Santa Barbara, then an elite job. When film director Alan Dwan, the top man at the American Film Company based in town, was having car trouble, a mutual friend directed him to a wealthy estate. There, Dwan saw a rangy fellow shooting target practice. Without turning around, Victor Fleming said, "Your tappet valve is stuck." Dwan saw camera equipment strewn around, asked what that was all about, and Fleming said he liked taking pictures very much. Dwan encouraged him to come to the Flying A, as the company was known because of its Pegasus logo. The mutual friend, by the way, was Marshall Neylan, who became Mary Pickford's favorite director. Fleming eventually became Alan Dwan's top cameraman, and when Dwan became the director of choice for Douglas Fairbanks Sr., the biggest star in the world, Fleming found an even more profound mentor and a lifelong friend. Fairbanks taught Fleming that America was a land of self-creation, and that in movies, action is the word. Watching a Fairbanks or a Fleming movie, you knew you were watching a motion picture. This backstory isn't just colorful biography. The history of American theatrical entertainment is full of characters who seem to come out of nowhere and bring with them into movies or theater a new range of experience and new appetites for invention. Fleming and Fairbanks were merry pranksters on a global scale, but they also helped create a vision of the American man as an athletic, can-do guy, working out his fate with blood, sweat, and laughs in the open air. Fairbanks' prestige was enormous. It was probably Fairbanks' pull that landed Fleming in the fledgling photographic section of the Signal Corps during World War I. He made some of the first military instruction films, taught cinematography at the Corps School at Columbia University, filmed high-security debarkations at Hoboken, and high-speed ordnance at the Aberdeen Military Proving Grounds. And after the war, he became Woodrow Wilson's personal cameraman during the president's tour of European capitals. If you want to see how much Fleming learned from Fairbanks about how to frame a shot and how to frame a personality, take a quick look at one of the first presidential photo ops. I love the way Wilson looks around at the end as if to ask, am I okay? Is it over? The best single artifact of Woodrow Wilson's trip to the Paris Peace Conference is in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. Edith Wilson's social secretary, Edith Benham, back in the 1940s, donated her papers, which include a very detailed scrapbook with all the still photos, many of which show Fleming cranking his movie camera, and even a booklet that showed where everyone was staying on the George Washington on the voyage to France. As soon as the war was over, Fleming rejoined Fairbanks. The Star had formed the most important talent-driven company in American movie history, United Artists, with Mary Pickford and D.W. Griffith. Fleming shot the company's first picture, His Majesty the American, and soon afterwards, Fleming made his directorial debut with a one-of-a-kind movie masterpiece, When the Clouds Roll By. I've cut the opening sequence down to 5 minutes, so forgive some of the stuttering of the music and the transitions, but you can see how inspired and funny the movie is. You can also see Fleming doing for the first time things that Orson Welles, Stanley Donen, Stanley Kubrick, and Fruit of the Loom would later take credit for. You'll also see a glimpse of Fleming himself. That was 1919, 90 years ago. Uh, well, that's not the whole film is full of that kind of invention, and it is becoming better known now that people are seeing it. One of the problems with Fleming's reputation is that until just last December, you couldn't see a decent copy of this movie. I had to go see it at MoMA. And luckily, I got there right before they relocated their library, so even that was kind of iffy. Now it's out on a pretty good DVD where I drew this clip. But have you ever seen the Manchurian Candidate? Have people seen the Manchurian? I just think it's so hilarious that the primal scene for entertainers seems to be winding up in a ladies' garden club of some kind. You know, but I think what's also great, what I love to show this clip, is that apart from it shows you how from the beginning how technically inventive he was. And how you see him using everything he knew. You can see how he used the high-speed filming of ordnance at the Aberdeen Military Proving Grounds to do slow motion, which was so rare at the time that the newspapers didn't even know how to describe it. They really described it more accurately as just high-speed filming. They didn't know how to tell people it was slow motion. But you also see him doing all the things that people would later, for some reason, doubt that he did in The Wizard of Oz. He's taking a known theatrical performer, Douglas Fairbanks, and casting him against type as neurotic, but finding ways of showing how athletic he is, just as he would do with all the figures in The Wizard of Oz, in a way. Cast Ray Bolger as a straw man who used Ray Bolger as a straw man who supposedly couldn't dance, but of course everything he does is a dance. And the combination of a camera fixed to a rotating set, which is how they did the walk up this wall and the walk up the wall in the ceiling, that's basically the same way Stanley Donen did it decades later in Royal Wedding, and Stanley Kubrick did it a half-century later in 2001. But beyond that, I just think you see an incredible confidence of a director who will just take outrageous material and go with it and understand the psychology of it, and understand the humor of it. And this was not rare for Fleming. I'd like to show off the library's work again with just another brief clip of a Fleming silent movie. It was the first movie he made after he split with Fairbanks, called Mama's Affair. And again, I think this will speak for itself. This is being restored currently by the Library of Congress, by the way. if some of that humor sounds familiar in a kind of Roaring Twenties sassy way, Anita Luce was the screenwriter on this movie. And actually is the best section of the movie. Has sort of very little to do with what follows, but it's really, really great in itself. Like I said, this is being restored right here at the Library of Congress, but many of Fleming's films have been lost forever. I jumped when I saw Momo advertise a showing of Fleming's 1926 epic The Rough Riders, but when I got there, it turned out all they had were editing room dupes of the same men marching or embarking on ships or rushing up San Juan Hill. The Library of Congress actually has better stuff, just a couple of minutes that are cut like a trailer. And at the very end, if we have time, I'll show them to you. By the time Fleming made The Rough Riders, he was at the height of his fame at Paramount Pictures. He had separated shrewdly from Fairbanks when Doug became hung up on making costume pictures. Fleming from the start showed his versatility in a variety of genres, and even pulled off prestigious literary adaptations, like his eloquent version of Conrad's Lord Jim. He had created a string of hits, including some lost-saying gray westerns, and he had shown a talent for launching new stars. In fact, he was better known in the 1920s for his knack with female stars like Norma Shearer and Clara Bow, on and off the set, than for his talent with directing male ones. In Mantrap, Fleming knew how to use Clara Bow so that she combined the sexiness of the vamp with the accessibility of the girl next door. Here's just a minute of her in the movie that made her the it girl, Mantrap, a year before she actually made the movie It. I love the way she flicks that glove off like she's a stripper. But she's so cute about it. And I mean cute in all senses of the word, including quick and clever. Even though Fleming and an up-and-comer named Gary Cooper vied for Beau's affections throughout the mid-1920s, Fleming was man enough to turn Cooper into the it boy with a movie called Wolfsong, and then turned him into an iconic superstar, the archetype of the strong silent man, in the title role of the Virginian. Mervyn Leroy had started as a juvenile actor and even performed in one of Fleming's Zane Grey westerns. He and Selznick, then a producer of Paramount, knew of Fleming's talent with women like Beau, men like Gary Cooper, and even children, and they admired his versatility. Another reason Fleming isn't well known today is that you can't pin him down, the way you can call Hitchcock the master of suspense, because that's all he did. Fleming did everything. When he went to MGM, he made the best erotic drama of the 1930s, Red Dust, and the first great showbiz screwball comedy, Bombshell, getting great performances from Jean Harlow in both. He made Gable a superstar in Red Dust and established Spencer Tracy as an actor's actor in Captains Courageous, which is also a great movie about growing up at sea. He made Henry Fonda a star in Farmer Takes a Wife. It's the movie that won Fonda the role of Lincoln. And he got Gable to cry over Spencer Tracy in a biting buddy movie and aerial adventure, Test Pilot. By the time he got the assignments to take over, first Oz, then Gone with the Wind, Oz from Richard Thorpe and George Cukor, and Wind from Cukor, he was ready. Let me give you a quick idea of exactly what he did.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too. You're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Now, John Fricke, who supervised some of the new DVD and Blu-ray edition of Wizard of Oz that's coming out now in its 70th anniversary year, told me they found previously unseen set stills of Fleming directing, and that he'd never seen a director so hands-on in his entire life as a film connoisseur. And this is a great example, this little passage is a great example of that. For one thing, the whole effect of Margaret Hamilton disappearing in the flame. Fleming knew that something that Steven Spielberg learned from him later, that to have an effect like that work, everything had to happen in one shot. You know, you couldn't cut suddenly to to her disappearance and suddenly she's not there and there's no frisson to it. So he was such a perfectionist about that, in fact, that Margaret Hamilton suffered severe burns as the Wicked Witch of the West, because she was supposed to descend in the trapdoor. And the fire effects went up before she was fully down. So that's a side effect of being such a perfectionist, but also of knowing how a movie should work. I also got to say, one thing that's a positive that I hope they don't do in the new discs is here you still get the illusion of her disappearing through somewhere, whereas in some of those new high-resolution images, you can see the outlines of the trapdoor, and I think that ruins the illusion. I think the directors there left a little leeway for themselves for that illusion. Now, the other thing that happens right after that is the Yellow Brick Road. Now, before Fleming took over the movie, the Yellow Brick Road didn't really have bricks as we know them. They were made of yellow ovals. It really looked in Munchkin Land more like a yellow patio than it did like a yellow brick road. He even added the curbing. And what's more, even though the first historians of the production of Wizard of Oz said that Fleming didn't have any musical background, so he clearly couldn't have been adept at adjusting the music for the different scenes, it was Fleming who ordered Yip Harburg and Harold Arlen to write the song Follow the Yellow Brick Road. He knew that the exit from Munchkin Land needed a big send-off, and them being, ace songwriters and very quick songwriters, managed to do that in 2 or 3 weeks before the filming was over in Munchkin Land. So here was this guy who, for decades, was known as someone who was just a traffic manager on Wizard of Oz, and yet he really took charge of every little aspect of that production, as well as the bigger aspects. He and his favorite screenwriter, John Lee Mahan, revamped the script so that even though Fleming didn't shoot the scenes in Kansas that were later shot by King Vidor when Vic was pulled off to do Gone with the Wind, he and his screenwriter had laid out the scenes in Kansas. And again, he was attentive to every detail of that, too. When he first got on the set and saw the clothes that they had for Auntie Em, he told the costume designer to rip that apron off and go to Woolworths and get the cheapest one you could find. This was a guy who knew about farms and living on a farm and living under hardscrabble circumstances. Vic had shot all the Oz scenes in Wizard of Oz. They did those first. Movies aren't usually shot in such discrete circumstances, but because of the nature of this movie, they did that. He was about to go off to Kansas, and all heck broke loose on the Gone with the Wind set. David O. Selznick, the producer, felt he wasn't getting the footage from George Cukor that he wanted, and the obvious guy to take over the film was Victor Fleming. Fleming shot 60% of the film. It's true that many other people contributed to it, but he is responsible, I think, for the key relationship between Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara. And he's also responsible, I think, for Clark Gable's performance in the movie in its entirety. He and Fleming had been developing a Rhett Butler kind of persona from the time they worked together on Red Dust. And I'd just like to show you a scene, actually not with Scarlett, but a scene with Hattie McDaniel, as the wonderful Hattie McDaniel as Mammy. That shows you some of the texture and relaxation that we rarely see in a Gable performance, but that Fleming got from him in Gone with the Wind.
She is beautiful, isn't she?
She sure is.
Did you ever see a prettier one?
Well, sir, Miss Scarlett was might not that pretty when she come, but not quite.
All the directors on Gone with the Wind, Cukor and Sam Wood and William Cameron Menzies and Selznick himself, did sublime work with Hattie McDaniel. But only Fleming could have gotten a performance that was at once this mellow and this charged from Gable. And I think he did it from lessons that he learned as long ago as the times he worked with Douglas Fairbanks. You remember the famous marital rape scene in Gone with the Wind when Rhett has to sweep up Scarlett in his arms and climb up that big flight of stairs in the Atlanta mansion. Technical snafus wrecked that for about 4 or 5 times. And on the 6th time, Gable was going up with Vivian Leigh in his arms, and he heard immense laughter break out from the crew behind him. And he turned around shocked, and there was Fleming just shaking his head and saying, no, we got the shot. I just had a bet going that you couldn't do it another time. And Gable responded in kind in this scene in particular. Part of the reason that I love it is that the liquor never stops flowing. And the story goes that when Gable was working with Hattie McDaniels, he substituted real scotch for her fake bourbon in that scene. I love that scene for the chemistry and the sympathy shared by 2 very different players, but also for its ruefulness about masculinity. Gable jokes about silly masculine pride in having a boy child instead of a girl child. He loves that he has a girl child. And he parodies masculine deviltry. Yet he takes pride in the virile dash he showed when Mammy shows him those red petticoats that he gave her. Nobility and fun, confidence and surprising sensitivity. These are some of the characteristics that Gable and Tracy and Cooper and Fonda got from working with Fleming. That's why he deserves to be known today, not just as a great director, but also as the real Rhett Butler. If I can just give you another few examples of the riches you have here at the Library of Congress. In the manuscript division, there are also the papers of McKinley Cantor, the author responsible for the work that was turned into the movie The Best Years of Our Lives. His papers are unique in the collections because as he donated them over a period of years, he always enclosed a typewritten running commentary on the background of whatever he was donating, and he'd tell funny stories. As a result, along with his treatment and memos for an unproduced version of Buffalo Bill at MGM, which would have starred Gable, there's a very funny story about Fleming's reaction when the front office turned the project down. I think it's worth reading exactly what Cantor says about this. Cantor learns that the MGM executives have turned it down because they knew Buffalo Bill, made a terrible picture of his own about his own life. And Cantor is saying that, well, everyone knew that was terrible. He even tried to get some of the same Indians against whom he had fought and have them in the picture. The poor old guys were limping around, and people were shooting off cap pistols. And it was a general mess. What's that got to do with our picture? And Cantor later recalled, about that time, there was a dreadful rumble from the deep couch behind me, and I turned to see Victor arising from where he had been stretched out. He said, "For blank, 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 blank's sake, let me tell you about the whole picture business as it's run at Metro. Don't you know that there are a whole bunch of blank, blank, blank blanks up on the 3rd floor who would rather sit around and blank, blank each other's blank blanks than make good pictures?" It's hard to determine. I mean, Cantor provided the blanks, but it's hard to determine whether that's what Victor was literally saying or not. Also in the recorded sound division in the NBC collection, the library holds a unique artifact of Gone with the Wind, the only recording of the Kay Kaiser broadcast at the Atlanta Junior League's Costume Bowl the night before the famous premiere in December 1939. It's just a half-hour band remote, and none of the actors from the film appeared on the broadcast, although they were in the audience. But it is accidentally hilarious in some ways. For starters, Kaiser opened with a spirited rendition of Dixie. And there's a sound that white Atlantans used to make when that was played that you don't hear anymore. There were quite a few rebel yells. They were authentic, if second-generation, rebel yells. Kurt Judson, my research associate, listened to that tape twice. And the second time, he had along a descendant of at least 8 people who were there. Best afternoon of his life, he told me. I had the most challenging and satisfying time of my writing life working on Victor Fleming, An American Movie Master. I hope you get a chance to look at it, and if you do, I hope you enjoy it. Now, I have a little clip that wouldn't work before, but it's 2 minutes of The Rough Riders, which is a movie that was totally lost. The Library of Congress has what looks like a trailer reel for it. So if you'd like one little more sample of the treasures that were lost through lack of film preservation and on some of the worth of the work that the library is doing in that. But just stick around for 2 more minutes. I'll just put this in. Now, are there any questions I can ask? I can answer you about Victor Fleming. Yes.
I read your book and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, it struck me that Victor Fleming was a member of the kind of alpha male John Ford school of filmmakers, and then if you ask him who he was or what he did, he would say, well, I'm a craftsman, I'm a real pro, but if you ask him, are you an artist, he would give a horse laugh. And well, at least John Ford.
Well, John Ford, I actually don't think Victor was as much like that as you'd think. Victor, of all that group of men who made great pictures like that, and there are a bunch of them, not just Ford, but William Wellman and others, you often heard them say things like that, and you often heard them talk just about craft and stuff. But whenever Vic gave interviews, and I think I quote this in the book, he always said the most important thing that a director had was sensitivity, that he needed to be sensitive enough to use actors who had sensitivity and to be sensitive enough to know how to use that quality. And that always struck me as being a real dividing line. He was much more openly emotional than a lot of these guys, and his films are a lot more openly emotional than a lot of these guys' films. And even though, no, I don't think one of the problems with his reputation is that he didn't speak in big terms about art, and he wasn't a self-promoter. I don't think he shied away from using the word art. In a lot of his interviews, especially as he grew up with the film business, he was much bigger in the business than Ford or Hawks were. At earlier times than they were. He would talk about actually people having to take the craft and art of movies very seriously, and he has an early interview saying he even though he came from exactly the opposite background, and that's one of the reasons we think he's so exciting. He was one of the first I found who calling for film schools. So he was actually, he really had a sense, I think, of craftsmanship to the point where it becomes art. I mean, he practiced it so intensely. That year when he was making Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, even when he was pulled off for Gone with the Wind, he would go back home for dinner with his wife and kids. He had become a devoted family man, much like Rhett Butler. He was a reformed rake who had wanted to be a devoted family man and really was totally devoted to his two daughters. And he went back to dinner with them every night, and then he'd go back to Culver City and do the editing of Wizard of Oz. And in the middle of that, he somehow put together a radio play with James Cagney. So he was a man of enormous energy, but real intense standards about what he wanted the image to accomplish. So Eddie Mannix, one of the top executives at MGM and Mayer's right-hand man, said he was the most exacting man on the lot. So, yeah. So no, I don't think he was as shy about talking about art and craft as that. And you talk about the challenges of each movie. He talked about how going from Gone with the Wind from Wizard of Oz to Gone with the Wind was so insane because, one was this work of pure imagination, and the other was this work which, whether you think it's real or not, he had to be real to the reality of that book, or else millions of people would be up in arms against him. So he talked very much about the challenges of each movie, even a movie that's sort of minor and but I think kind of fun, like Tortilla Flat. He knew that it was a different kind of movie to make in Hollywood. It was anecdotal, it was loose, there was a group hero. He was very conscious, I think, of the challenges each movie presented. And I think that's one reason that he was so vital and really until the terrible end of his career with Joan of Arc, is that he really did look for new challenges.
Well, thank you. I want to say thank you. That's an excellent answer. And my follow-up, since you gave such a long answer, I want to ask you to respond to was that it was just always interesting to me why the contrast in Europe, you find many more directors talking consciously about this art of cinema, and you don't in America. And I just wondered if it was more of an American trait of anti-intellectualism or so forth, or association with art as a feat, or was it more a personality of somebody like John Ford? But please don't go there.
Yeah, that. Yeah, I guess the question is there a gap between Europeans and Americans in terms of willingness to talk about film as art? And there probably is. And let me also say, though, in terms of Victor, I mean, I think the aspect that you thought of, that you bring up about him not being self-conscious about it, and not self-conscious as sort of the elevated artiste, and no, he was not that. And that's part of, I think, a very American thing. And also the sense that he didn't bring any trained theatrical vocabulary to it, that all these guys were originals and learned how to, like Ford and Wellman, and learned how to communicate with their actors and their technicians by knowing the craft and by using their own personality. I mean, probably the key stuff in Fleming, and one reason he's was such an interesting guy to do a book about, was that the biography and the art really are entwined, but not in the usual ways. It's not that he had all the experiences that went into all of his movies, although I think it is interesting, the parallels you do see sometimes, even in, as I said, in Oz and Gone with the Wind, but that he had a core of feeling that came, I think, both from the death of his father when he was 4, and also from being brought up in a very vital extended family, like I said, with a very strong aunt and uncle, and a really close tie to his mother. So, I think that guys like that wanted to guard their instinct, whether consciously or unconsciously. I did think they wanted to guard their instinct and use their intuition in terms of how they dealt with different actors, and they dealt with each of them very specifically, I think. Yes.
Was Finding Theater today that you recommend?
Oh, Up, the Pixar movie. Yeah, I think the Pixar people actually are a throwback to the old silent comedy days. I mean, I think they make films the same way. I think they study Keaton and Chaplin and those guys in terms of timing and story and character, and I think what they do is great. And at a more low-down way, I kind of like Drag Me to Hell too. So, but anyway, yeah, yes.
Yes. Could you say a little bit more about that controversy about whether he directed Gone with the Wind? You said he did 60%, but they were trying to take away his credit.
Yeah, David O. Selznick was a producer, and he was a great producer, but he was a producer who knew how to promote himself as well as his pictures, and he always took credit for the primary credit, and his people always gave him primary credit for Gone with the Wind, and there's some truth in that. He hired George Cukor first, who was a famous director even then at the time. Selznick and Cukor had done many successful films before together, including David Copperfield, another big literary adaptation. And so Cukor had already done some work on it. A few of maybe 5% of the film is George Cukor's. At some point, Fleming had a nervous breakdown and was off for 2 weeks, and Sam Wood came in and shot for those 2 weeks, and then continued shooting scenes in a kind of alternate unit, although no scenes that centered on Rhett Butler, interestingly enough. So he did a certain percentage, maybe 15% or so of the film. William Cameron Menzies was a famous production designer who really sort of trailblazed the modern notion of production designer as someone who sets an overall look for the film. He did, the most massive storyboards yet for a Hollywood film for this movie, and he did do some shooting, so a lot of people want to give him credit for a lot of the directing. But not only did Vic actually shoot 60% of the film by Selznick's own estimate, but he was also reviewing all the footage that the other directors were doing. So he really was working as the primary director. I mean, if you go through even Selznick's own memos with an open mind and open eye, which I did, you'll find Selznick saying something like, "Oh, Menzies took that shot of the Union cavalry going over the bridge too fast, Vic says. We should reshoot it." So obviously Vic was in the room with him reviewing the footage of the other directors. And there are also notes that say, the adding business, working very much like the director he would on his own Victor Fleming Productions. So I think between that and the fact that Gable was bringing to a sort of new level the kind of character he'd been working with on a number of pictures with Fleming, like the Red Dust, Test Pilot, and others, I think you really have to give Fleming substantial credit for Gone with the Wind, even though a lot of people over the years, what stymies me is that people want to give George Cukor so much credit, and he really only shot, even his biggest fan, Gavin Lambert, the critic who wrote an early book about Gone with the Wind, said he was only 5% of the finished movie is Cukor's. I mean, it's true that Vivian Leigh and Olivia de Havilland had a separate relationship with Cukor and would go to see him on weekends and off days for notes. But Vic was the guy on the set. Even if they came to him with Cukor's ideas, he was the guy who was going to accept that or not. So I never understood. I mean, to me, the idea that he's not giving credit for Wizard of Oz is insane. But the idea that he's not giving credit for Gone with the Wind, you can sort of justify just because of how murky the production was with so many hands involved. Yet still, I think he earned that single credit that he got, and he earned his Academy Award. It was the only Academy Award he won was for Gone with the Wind, for Best Director. Yeah. Yeah.
Did Fleming write stuff, either letters or screenplays?
A few letters of his survive, in the book, the ones that are quoted at length, there are a few to his mother, and also a few to Ingrid Bergman, who was the last love of his life. He met her on the set of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where he got her one of her sexiest performances out of her, and she fell in love with him and knew that he was a great director for her. He did not have an affair with her on that set, contrary to what others have written before. He really was determined to be to toe the line, and but about half dozen years later, he was floundering a little bit. He had made his last picture at MGM. He was toying with independent filmmaking. Walter Wanger, who had been through World War I with him, actually in Paris, was interested in having Victor join one of his companies and had him go see Ingrid Bergman and Joan of Lorraine, which became Joan of Arc in New York, and that was it. They fell into each other's arms and decided to make what turned out to be a really terrible movie together, and their affair didn't last through the making of the movie, and Victor didn't last that much afterwards. He died just a few weeks after its premiere. Yeah.
In the sort of the cabinet of directors, was he, as far as being paid, was he one of the higher paid directors, like, as far as the...
Yeah, he was absolutely one of the higher paid directors. I mean, I can't tell you for sure if he was the highest paid because I only had access to his legal files, but he was very, very highly paid. And I mean, he negotiated a contract. He was being paid $3,000 a week in the 30s, and by the time he negotiated a contract, which he only went into effect after Gone with the Wind, he was like getting $4,265 or something a week in the early 40s and through the mid 40s. So that was a lot of money. Anything else? But he himself said, "Well, that doesn't matter. I made just as much money in the 30s before in the early 30s and the 20s before Franklin Roosevelt's tax bite came in." So, so that was no big deal to him. I actually don't think he was in it for the money. I actually don't. Wizard of Oz, probably he got less money from many of his movies. I really think he loved the craft, and he did it so intensely. I think that intensity came out of love. And anything else? Well, if that's it, thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.